Tonight, we revisit a case that couldn't have been tried a generation earlier. A case that only worked because science had finally learned to speak for the dead. In the spring of 1897, in a city still riding high off its own World's Fair, a woman named Louisa Luetgert walked out of her own house and was never seen again. No body was ever found, no burial, no grave to visit, then or now. What was recovered from a factory vat that spring did not amount to a body, but it was enough, eventually, to change the way the American legal system asked a jury to believe in a murder it could not see. Chicago in 1897 was still trading heavily on its own recent myth. 4 years earlier, it had hosted the world's Columbian Exposition, the White City, electric lights strung across the fairgrounds, a nation's proof of its own progress. Beneath that gleam, the North Side ran on tanneries, breweries, and meatpacking plants. One man had made himself a fixture of that world. Adolph Luetgert came to Chicago from Germany as a young man, arriving not long after the Great Fire of 1871 leveled much of the city and opened the door for anyone willing to rebuild. He worked tanneries, then opened a saloon at Claiborne and Webster, then moved into meat. By 1892, he owned the largest sausage manufacturing plant in the city, 5 stories on Hermitage Avenue, shipping bratwurst and knockwurst by the millions of pounds. Around the neighborhood, they called him the Sausage King. He employed more men than almost anyone within a mile of the plant, and neighbors credited his factory with putting most of the money in the neighborhood into their pockets in the first place. He kept 2 Great Danes at his side on his walks. Neighbors gave him the sidewalk. Some took off their hats when he passed. He had been married twice. His first wife died in childbirth. His second, Louisa Luetgert, was a German domestic servant, nearly 10 years his junior. Petite by most contemporary descriptions, and quiet, though quiet in the historical record usually just means undocumented. She joined him first at the saloon, then at the house beside the factory. For years, theirs was as much a working partnership as a marriage, run alongside a business that was, for most of that time, thriving. By 1997, both the marriage and the business were in serious trouble. The business was genuinely close to failure. Luetgert had fallen victim to a financial swindle in the mid-1990s and gone deep into debt with Chicago's Foreman Brothers Bank, trying to keep the plant afloat. By early 1997, the plant had gone almost silent. The round-the-clock operation Luetgert once boasted about now amounted, by his own later explanation, to little more than watching idle machinery. The marriage was unraveling right alongside it, and not quietly. Neighbors and household staff later testified to frequent audible arguments, most of them about money. Louisa reminded her husband more than once, and not gently, that his financial troubles were entirely his own doing. Luetgert had stopped sleeping in the house next to the factory. Instead, he'd taken a small room beside his office, one with its own bed, which he was, according to multiple household accounts, sharing with the family's young housemaid. That housemaid, Mary Siemering, was Louisa's own cousin, which made the arrangement, even in an already troubled household, a particularly bitter one. Whatever was happening in that marriage by the spring of 1897, it was no secret to the people who lived and worked around it. On night of April 30th, 1897, Adolph Luetgert had several workmen come to the factory to help fire up the steam system, an unusual request for a plant that had gone almost silent in the preceding months. Once the steam was running, he sent the men away on an errand and stayed at the factory alone for the rest of the night. Louisa was last credibly seen that evening. By the next morning, she was gone. When the workmen came back, they noticed something wrong in the basement. One of the large sausage vats held a thick, reddish, foul-smelling residue, and the same substance had pooled on the floor nearby. It was strange enough that someone reported it, first to the night watchman and eventually to the Chicago police. When his children asked where their mother had gone, Adolph told them she'd left to visit her sister. When Louisa's brother, Diedrich Bicknessy, hadn't heard from her after several days and grew alarmed enough to go to the police himself, Adolph told a different story, that his wife had left him outright, possibly for another man, possibly back to Germany for good. The two stories didn't match each other, and neither matched what the workmen had already reported seeing in the basement. Police drained the vat. What they recovered was small. It would turn out to be enough. Fragments of a woman's metal corset, 2 gold rings, one engraved with the initials LL, and bone. Tiny, calcined fragments, burned and broken down almost past recognition, mixed into the residue alongside a hairpin, scraps of charred cloth, and a false tooth recovered separately from the ashes of the factory's furnace. Investigators also learned Luetgert had recently bought arsenic and a substantial quantity of potash, a caustic, potassium-rich compound capable, under the right conditions, of breaking down organic tissue over time. He'd later claimed the potash was for making soap to clean the factory floors. Prosecutors calculated that the roughly 378 pounds he'd bought would have produced close to 2,000 pounds of soap, far more than the factory could plausibly use and far more expensive than just buying soap outright. There was no body, and there would never be one. What the state had instead was a drained vat, a strange residue, 2 rings, and a set of bone fragments small enough to fit inside a matchbox. And the task, almost entirely new to American law at this scale, of convincing 12 jurors that fragments like these could stand in for a corpse. Trying a murder without a body wasn't new to American courts. Half a century earlier, in Boston, the trial of Harvard chemistry professor John Webster for the killing of Dr. George Parkman had set the precedent. A defendant could be convicted without a complete corpse. That case leaned partly on a dentist's identification of dental remains pulled from a furnace to prove Parkman was, in fact, dead. The Luetgert case pushed that precedent into far more uncertain territory. The fragments from the vat were smaller, more degraded, more genuinely ambiguous than anything used in the Webster trial decades earlier. The defense's position was simple and, on its face, entirely plausible. These were animal bones, an ordinary byproduct of sausage manufacturing, nothing more. To answer that, prosecutors turned to a 29-year-old anthropologist named George Dorsey, assistant curator at Chicago's Field Columbian Museum, and one of the first Americans ever to earn a PhD in anthropology, awarded from Harvard in 1984. Dorsey examined the fragments, pieces he identified as portions of a skull, a rib, and a thigh bone, and testified under oath that they were human, that they belonged to a small adult woman. By most historians' accounts, this was the first time a professionally trained anthropologist had ever testified as an expert witness in an American criminal trial. Forensic anthropology as a discipline with a recognized place inside the courtroom effectively begins here, in a Chicago courtroom in the autumn of 1997. The first trial opened in August 1997 before Judge Richard Tuthill, with State Attorney Charles S. Deneen prosecuting. It was, by any measure, a sensation. Chicago's newspapers ran daily coverage for weeks, competing openly for scoops. Reporters for the Chicago Daily Journal reportedly lowered one of their own down by rope down a heating shaft, trying to eavesdrop on jury deliberations. Luetgert himself was widely described by courtroom observers as calm to the point of indifference, apparently confident he'd walk free. The defense leaned hard on the absence at the center of the case: no body, no confirmed cause of death, and a growing string of people across the country claiming to have seen Louisa alive in the weeks after her disappearance. Against that, prosecutors offered the vat residue, the rings, Dorsey's identification of the bones as human, and a demonstration using an actual cadaver and a potash mixture matching what Luetgert had purchased, showing the jury that a human body could in fact be reduced under those conditions to exactly the kind of reddish residue found pooled on the factory floor. After 3 days, the jury couldn't agree. The judge declared a mistrial. The second trial opened in January 1898 at the same courthouse. Dorsey returned to the stand, this time, by most accounts, in stronger, more confident terms than before. The defense's theory of a wife who'd simply walked away remained entirely unproven. Against it, the rings, the residue, a purchase of potash far beyond any plausible cleaning need, and a marriage multiple independent witnesses had already described as under serious, sustained strain. This time, the jury convicted him. Adolph Luetgert was sentenced to life in prison, sent to serve it at Joliet State Penitentiary. He maintained his innocence the whole time, insisting, even from behind prison walls, that his wife had simply left him of her own accord. He didn't serve long. Just over a year into his sentence, on July 7, 1999, Adolph Luetgert died of heart disease at Joliet. He was 53. Louisa Luetgert's remains, to the extent remains is even the right word here, were never formally recovered or buried in any conventional sense. The fragments Dorsey examined stayed with the court, retained as evidence trial. There was no funeral for her, not in any way the historical record usually understands a funeral. What existed in the end was a set of bone fragments in an evidence room, a courtroom transcript, and a verdict. The Luetgert case, cited today by historians of forensic science as a genuine founding moment in their field, the point where a credentialed scientist first stood in an American courtroom and spoke under oath for evidence too small and too damaged to speak for itself. George Dorsey's testimony here would go on to shape how expert forensic witnesses were used and understood in American courtrooms for decades. Worth saying plainly, modern forensic anthropologists have real documented doubts that fragments this small and this badly burned could have been reliably identified as human at all, let alone confidently identified as female by the standards of any era, including Dorsey's own. The jury in 1898 believed him completely. Whether the bones themselves could actually support that belief remains, more than a century later, a genuinely open question among specialists. What convicted Adolph Luetgert may in the end owe less to the bones than everything around them: the rings pulled from the vat, the unexplained purchase of an industrial quantity of potash, and a marriage that had by every independent account already come apart well before that night in April. The case of Louisa Luetgert closes the record examined here tonight. No grave marks where she's buried, because there was, in any meaningful sense, nowhere left to bury her. What remains, more than a century on, is a courtroom transcript, a small handful of bone fragments preserved as evidence, and an entire discipline of forensic science that traces part of its own origin back to a drained vat in a Chicago sausage factory.